We're going to do our next Ulysses on the Clock installment from Austin Briggs, our friend Austin at Hamilton College, an excerpt from Hades. If you can hit that for us, Ben.
I'm going to be reading a passage from the 6th episode of Joyce's Ulysses, Hades. The situation is easy. Bloom is in a cab with 4 friends. No, they're not friends, they're companions, and there are 3 of them, with 3 companions. And they're on their way to Hades to go to attend a funeral at Glasnevin Cemetery outside of Dublin. It's an easy passage on one level. It doesn't require the kind of endless annotation that so much of Ulysses does. Classical languages, foreign languages of all sorts, topical references, songs that nobody sings anymore, all the literary references, none of that. We need one footnote, in fact, as far as I can see, and that is the word quiff. Somebody's airing his quiff. And his quiff is a lock of hair. And that may indicate that he's a kind of a dude wearing his hair with a quiff. And probably the word probably is related to coiffure in French, or at least so I think. Well, let's begin here. But before I begin, just 3 or 4 lines above. Bloom thinks to himself, he's coming in the afternoon, her songs. Can you read that? Who's he and who's she? And in fact, when you find out who he is a little further down, where I'm going to read, still won't help you very much because you don't know who this Blazes Boylan is. But after you've read Ulysses once again, or twice, or 3 times, or 4 times, or whatever, you will know very well who Blazes is. He has an assignation to go to bed with Bloom's wife, Molly, this very afternoon, and Bloom knows about it. Well, here we go. Blazes Boylan, Mr. Powers said. There he is, airing his quiff. Just that moment, I was thinking. Mr. Dedalus, son, Stephen's father, bent across to salute. From the door of the Red Bank, with a straw hat flashed. Spruce figure passed. Mr. Bloom reviewed the nails of his left hand, and then the nails of his right hand. The nails, yes. Is there more in him than they, she, sees as men? Nice, it's not a typo. They, women, see. No, not just women. My wife, Molly. Fascination, worst man in Dublin. That keeps them alive. They sometimes feel what a person is. Instinct. But a type like that. My nails, I'm just looking at them. Well paired. Well, the nails may be well paired, but Molly and Stephen and Bloom clearly aren't. And after thinking alone, body getting a bit softer, I would notice that from remembering. What causes that? Whose skin can't contract quickly enough when the flesh falls off. But the shape, no, not the shape, Molly's shape. The shape is still there. Shoulders, hip, night of the dance. Shift stuck between the cheeks behind. Every woman watching this, and most of the men, I suppose, know that reference. But if you're quite a young man, you may not know that that's one of the things that women have to deal with. He clasped his hands behind his knees and, satisfied, sent his vacant glance over their faces. Mr. Power asked, how is the concert tour getting on, Bloom? Elsewhere, they will ask him, who's getting it up, which we will have a good guffaw over. Here, who's getting it on? Bloom. Not on a first-name basis like the other people, for he is the outsider here. Thank you.
And Leah Senatro is currently pursuing her PhD in English at UC Irvine. Her research interests include the medical humanities, rhetoric and composition, and digital multimodality. Dr. Katherine O'Callaghan lectures on James Joyce, modernism, Irish literature, and the role of music in novels at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's a member of the Board of Trustees, the International James Joyce Foundation. She is the editor of Essays on Music and Language in Modernist Literature, Musical Modernisms, and the co-editor with Una Frawley of Memory, Ireland, Volume 4, James Joyce and Cultural Memory. She's completing a monograph on music and soundscape in James Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake.
Hello, everyone. First, I want to extend my thanks to the conference organizers for putting together such a fantastic event. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to go again tomorrow. So I'm going to start with the quote that's sort of become the refrain of the conference, so feel free to join in if you would like. Joyce sought to give a picture of Dublin so complete that if the city one day suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book. Now I'm going to follow that up with another quote from Joyce that we have from Frank Budgeon. My book is the epic of the human body. In my book, the body lives in and moves through space and is the home of the full human personality. Rather than viewing the city's layout as a flat map from an aerial view, we experience Dublin primarily from the body's perception, with every sense filling in the map. To name a few instances, Stephen's boots crushing the shells of Sandymount Strand, Bloom's eyes tracing the contours of the stonecutter's yard at Glasnevin Cemetery, and Bloom marking Sweeney's from the chemist's scent on Lincoln Place. In this presentation, I first show how Joyce's narrative builds Dublin through vibrant sensorial experiences and synesthetic descriptions. Then I use a disability studies perspective to read the gaps of these sensorial experiences, which emphasize a body that resists categorization and builds a fragmented sensorial cartography. Finally, to reconstruct Dublin from the perspective of the body as map maker and to contribute to the growing work in the digital humanities and multimodality within Joyce scholarship, summarized a few here, I have created a multimodal digital map as a model of a sensorial reading cartography built from the ekphrastic, synesthetic, and sensorial narrative. I have chosen to focus my analysis on the Sirens episode because the Ormond Hotel serves as both a rich sensorium and locational hub, while Bloom eats and drinks after attending Paddy Dignan's funeral, and where Blazes Boylan stops for a drink before his affair with Molly. According to the Gilbert schema, the episode is defined by the art of music and technique of fugue Kahneman, a specific musical arrangement that is characterized by multiple voices that repeat and build on themselves. If Odysseus had had his men's ears stopped with wax while sailing through the dangerous passage of the Sirens, whose beautiful song would spellbind any man alive, but instead insisted to keep his own ears open with his hands tied to the mast, the reader's experience in Bloom's of the Sirens episode is that of Odysseus's. Our ears are open and immediately become full of sound. Following a poetic introduction of various fragments, of which we had a great reading of yesterday, whose rhythm introduces us to the musical score of the episode, we hear the sounds of the concert room at the Ormond Hotel, the panting, sighing of the crowd, the giggling peal of the sirenic barmaids, Blazes Boylan's creaking shoes on the wood floor, and the jingling of his jaunting car as he heads towards Eccles Street. Along with the lyrics of different songs, the band is playing and the tap, tap, tap of the blind piano tuner's cane. Such descriptions contribute to what Jeremy Colangelo calls a sensory textual screen, wherein the body mediates sensory experience, which is mirrored in the form and style of the text, and creates a relationship between physical and narrative embodiment. This sensory textual screen becomes the basis of our embodied cartography mapped by sense experience. The episode's narrative composition is built by sensorial and synesthetic language that mimics music ekphrastically and locates the characters and the reader on number 8 Ormond key, not by its cross-street location, but from eye, or perhaps even better, ear level. By sensorial, I mean language that affects the senses and invokes sense perception. For example, we hear the onomatopoeic tap, tap, tap of the blind stripling's cane as he navigates to and through the hotel to retrieve his forgotten tuning fork. However, these sensorial descriptions are also often synesthetic, in that the perception affects alternative senses and often multiple senses simultaneously. For example, the bronze and gold of the barmaid's hair, a visual perception, becomes an auditory description of the way their voices sound. In a giggling peal, young gold-bronze voices blended, bronze giggle gold to let free fly their laughter. Now we are experiencing synesthesia and seeing sounds and hearing sights. Such synesthesia and sensorial imagery is made possible through ekphrastic description in that language represents different perceptions verbally, which builds the sensory textual screen, and narrative embodiment also experienced by the reader. However, such description is not limited to sight and sound in the chapter. In her book, Haptic Modernism, Abby Garrington explores haptic happenings in modernist texts, and with her reading of Ulysses, establishes a relationship between touch and sight through sculpture as a visual experience of art that invites the caress of the eye. Garrington focuses her reading on descriptions of Gertie and Molly's bodies as statuesque, which complicates the texture of skin as perceived as stone, and combines the visual with touch. And the same model of synesthetic perception that the haptic visual generates applies to the barmaid's voices, the description of which weaves multiple sense experiences together to form a single description. The gold and bronze voices commingle into one metallic voice that creates a sensorial experience of a haptic, optic, and aural nature, showcasing the technique of music to prose ekphrasis and situating the body through such perceptions within the Ormond Hotel. By metonymically describing the women, their voices, and their laughter as gold and bronze, the women take on sculptural qualities, as both gold and bronze can be forged and cast into statues, and so do the sounds that they make. So the women and their voices become metallic, their giggle gold and gold bronze voices take on material sound, which gives a haptic quality to the voice itself. So Bloom watches with his eyes, sees with his ears, and touches with every sense. Later in the episode, the voices are described by their vibrations. So voice is perceptible via the ear, which is the organ of the chapter, but it is also haptic with tactile and vibrational quality. Bite Martina Plock cites this vibration, as well as the vibration of the tuning fork, which I will discuss shortly, as an opening for a physiological reading of perception and the physical processes of listening that showcase, and I'm quoting here, Joyce's prioritization of the body as a site of critical examination. However, I would like to add that such moments of hapticity and tactile synesthesia also become locational, or the means of which the body is oriented in space within the chapter. Touch is a unique sense and is even more location dependent than other senses. We've all been made well aware exactly what we can and cannot touch from 6 feet apart. So such perceptions, especially synesthetic ones, become the beginning of our embodied cartography. For example, the vibrations of the tuning fork establish the location of the saloon as separate from the bar and lunchroom in the Ormond, as both Boylan and Bloom are approaching the hotel. From the saloon, a call came, long and dying. That was a tuning fork, the tuner that he forgot that he now struck. A call again, that he now posed that it now throbbed. You hear? It throbbed. Purer, softly and softlier, its buzzing prongs, longer and dying call. The sound of the tuning fork, both audible and tactile, is sensorial, if not also a little bit sensual, and its throbbing and buzzing establishes the map of the Ormond Hotel through tactile listening. So perception orients Dublin and also orients its occupants, and this perception, often synesthetic, is made available to us as readers through language, making language itself part of the cartography, or the thing that constructs Dublin through what Colangelo calls the sensory textual screen. The synesthesia of the giggle gold and bronze laughter and the voice's vibrations show how the voice, our body giving way to language, is space-dependent, haptic, and sensorial. Another example of language's location dependence that I will mention but not discuss here is Joyce's use of free indirect discourse as the tone of a character's thoughts hovers around their body and the actions they take within the narrative. So language in its ekphrasis becomes navigable via the haptic body and vice versa. With this claim, I am working to draw on a long tradition that links touch to language and rhetoric. Quintilian noted the importance of gesture for successful rhetorical communication, and Galen paired the hand with human reason. However, for every sense description that orients the body and contributes to the sensorial mapping of the episode, there is also a disorientation. The fugal qualities layer sense over sense over sense to the point of overwhelm, just like so many sailors were driven off course from the siren songs. Judith Palton actually calls the body in sirens as a source of chaos. Its flood of perceptions actually becomes a source of intelligibility. Such overload reflects what Plock identifies as Joyce's radical experimentation with representing physicality, which defamiliarizes or disorients the world and breaks the body into fragments. Plock explains that nowhere does Joyce represent bodies or their parts as easily classifiable, manageable units, and instead chose to create a fragmented physiology. We see this in the inseparability of senses that defy categorization, as discussed with examples of synesthesia earlier. I argue that the cartography of Dublin itself is also fragmented by the sensorial narrative and subsequently disoriented as perceptions bleed through the map into new spaces and are unable to be contained, just like the bodies. But before I elaborate on this point, I want to explore the role of sensory gaps in the episode. While we have spent a great deal looking at the hypersensorial, the hyposensorial plays a very important role in the episode as well, as it did in Joyce's life. Joyce suffered myopia as well as a painful inflammatory eye disease, and as Robert Volpicelli elucidates, his works have many low vision qualities, which become strategic methods of narrative disturbance. I'd like to point out that each of the last two quotes I shared about the tuning fork as well as the giggle gold vibrations are characterized by the end of perception as well. The now silent air after the vibrations, and the ending dying call of the tuning fork. We see such narrative disturbance. It also becomes evidence for a cartographic disturbance, which is emphasized in blindness and deafness through the characters of the blind piano tuner and the deaf waiter Pat. However, as much as blindness and deafness can be construed as a disorientation and therefore a shortcoming, reading blindness and deafness from a disability studies perspective reveals how such sensorial gaps are actually a reorientation to the world, as opposed to a disorientation. J. Dalmage argues that disability is a way of making meaning and knowledge and provides its own ontology that is not characterized by lack, but by generative thought and experience. Dalmage offers a methodology of metis, or a cunning, adaptive, embodied intelligence. This metis becomes a way of moving in the world, a way of navigating Dublin that is not typical or normative, but is still rich with sensorial and synesthetic experience. Such metis works through the sensory textual screen to affect both the narrative embodiment within the story and the physical embodiment of its readers, which challenges the notion of the body as easily categorizable and pushes against conceptions of the normative body as an abled one. The blind piano tuner provides an excellent example of disability fragmenting the normative body and what we imagine bodily capability to be. We first meet the blind stripling when Bloom helps him across the street in the Lestragonians episode. As Bloom guides him, Bloom wonders how the young man could sense something if it were removed, or feel a gap just as he sensed the presence of the van. This gap that Bloom ponders showcases the metis way that a disabled body can move through the world, because this gap would not be determined by an absence or something that could not be perceived, but by something that could be perceived. Additionally, such methods of perception indicate that blindness does not deny the power of visualization, and body parts cannot be neatly categorized, and their functions cannot be cut off from the rest of the body. The blind stripling orients himself haptically with his cane, which Garrington describes as a seeing hand, which then takes the young man to the Ormond, where we as readers are also oriented towards the stripling's location via the tap, tap, tap that punctuates the episode's sensory textual screen. The stripling performs metis by moving through the spatial environment of Dublin and builds an alternate cartography by doing so. Similarly, Pat, which is tap spelled backwards, the deaf waiter also reorients the coordinates of the sensorial map by performing metis. Though he is deaf, his motions contribute to the visual plane of the episode's screen, Pat, to and fro, bald Pat. Additionally, his ear becomes haptic when Bloom signs to him and uses gesture to communicate. Pat responds with a pad of paper and ink. While the barmaids' voices became vibrational, Pat's words become tactile in that they are written. Pat is not denied communication or navigation in an episode completely characterized by sound. Instead, his hearing is haptic, as he can feel the vibrations or hear Bloom's gesture, showing again how parts of the body cannot be reduced by their function, and the role of bodily function in the episode displaces any standardized or normative bodily physiology. To practice mentis and investigate the Ormond Hotel as a locational hub through its rich sensorium, I created a multimodal reading cartography using a free virtual tour website and a tablet drawing app. The cartography is meant to emphasize the perceptive experience of number 8 Ormond Quay. Since the body resists categorization and irreducibility, so does Dublin's cartography. We experience this fragmentation through the sensory textual screen, which makes it possible to perceive sense perceptions within and outside the hotel in a way that would be impossible had we been enjoying lunch there. For example, the jingling of Boylan's jaunting car as he approaches the Ormond, the creaking of his shoes while he walks through the saloon, and then the jingling once again as he approaches the ever-present Eccles Street. Similarly, we hear the tapping of the blind piano tuner's cane before he arrives at the hotel, and we also follow Bloom's footsteps and his eyes watching the barmaids before he even enters the hotel, all while we can hear them talking and laughing. The sensorial description and fragmented body create a sort of locational synesthesia that reorients the cartography of Dublin in a way that is irreducible and defies categorization or neat mapping. Just going to pull it up real quick. And I'll click through in a second. But when interacting with my own version of the sensory textual screen, you have to begin with the hand and the sense of touch. You cannot see anything unless you touch the mouse and click around, and even when you do click around, the virtual tour format prevents you from seeing more than a couple aspects of the reading cartography at once, which contributes to the hyposensorial aspects of the text. I was also purposefully messy and sketchy in my attempt. I didn't color inside the lines to emphasize the bleeding quality of a fragmented cartography. By interacting with this multimodal reading cartography, readers can practice navigating a world while performing metis and resisting reducibility and embracing a reorientation with this epic of the body. So, just a couple. So there are the barmaids. There's Bald Pat. Then you look down, you have to scroll down. There's Boylan's shoes, Bloom playing cat's cradle with the napkin, the jaunting car from outside, all kind of loop together with the tap, 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 and then the kind of ever-present Eccles Street, and the piano, as well as the vibrating tuning fork. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone. It's wonderful to be here. So great to be back in person with everyone, and I'd really like to thank the organisers of this entire event. Thank you to Leah also for that wonderful talk. I'm also speaking about sirens, so I'll be coming back to a few of those moments that she referred to, and I'm going to start with the little performance we had from Sam Sloat yesterday when he did one of our Ulysses on the Clock with the opening of the Sirens episode. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. Lots of little fragments. Bronze by gold, heard the hoof irons, steely ringing, impertinent, And in Sloat's performance, he read very quickly and playfully through the fragments, and I think he was reveling in the coming together of sound effects, focusing the attention of us as the audience on quirky coincidences and repetitions, contrasts and expansions. And in this sounded performance of the text, someone encountering it for the first time might have recognized that this was a movement more concerned with sound than sense. So that little opening section of the episode has been described as an overture, or that it's in some sort of fugal form, or that Anthony Burgess believed it was the bones of the sailors that we have to climb over as the sirens are calling us. But I'm thinking particularly of the instruction to listen that we get in that opening section. And I'm thinking of how Katherine Flynn brought us to the etymology of obedience as being audire, to listen. And in that, the extracted sound effects of those disjointed phrases of the opening section, we are really being instructed to listen, to obey, to turn signs on the page into sounds. But I'm going to suggest here in this paper that that makes them a little bit of an anomaly in Ulysses when it comes to sound effects. And I think what we begin to recognize from this display of proleptic echoes is that Joyce actually rarely represents a sound in isolation. Joyce is profoundly conscious of how sound travels in its environment, where it comes from and returns to, where it echoes, how it affects the surroundings in which it reverberates. Beyond the restrictions of a visual witnessing of the material, the reader can experience this soundscape as an almost active agent, guiding and luring characters, assigning certain sounds to people as they pass by. For the reader, these sonic pathways and networks produce an aural cartography of Dublin, a mapping of both the rendered and interior sounds encountered by both the characters and the narrative voices. So music is the thematic content of the episode, but is also evidence of the episode's technique and form that guide the manner in which we read the book as a whole. Leopold Bloom's emotional conflict is evident through his actions in this episode. He finds himself compelled to witness Boylan setting off to see Molly, and he goes to great lengths to distract his mind from what he knows will occur. The narrative lens, or more frequently the microphone, remains on the whole with Bloom in the Ormond Hotel, although we are also privy to the sounds of Boylan's jingling journey on the Jarvie car that we saw in that wonderful illustration. The Sirens episode alerts the reader to pay attention to how many incidents in this book are heard, not seen. Bloom is at the core of the episode, the tuning fork around which all else swirls, and he must navigate the dangers of both sirens and suitors to emerge as the unconquered hero. So the episode is riven into two parts. First, we have this little sequence of words and phonemes, sound effects, and we then have the order to begin. And the episode proper follows, in which those initial fragments can be found scattered and embellished. The main body of the episode opens with the sounds of the iron-shod horses' hooves. The noise created by the viceregal cavalcade, a procession of carriages that we saw on the map and that Katherine Flynn showed us so wonderfully, this sound enters into the bar, it infiltrates the bar of the Ormond Hotel. And I think this is an indicator of a central aspect of the episode, an exploration of the manner in which sound travels and what can be heard where. So the steely ringing of the horse's hoofs caused the barmaids to peer out the window and comment on the passing carriage. So this event has already been described for us, in fact, at the end of the previous episode, Wandering Rocks, across the cross-blind of the Ormond Bar, gold by bronze, Miss Kennedy's head by Miss Douce's head, watched and admired. And the manner in which the action is described indicates how the carriage occupants perhaps hope to be seen themselves, to be visually perceived, that is, favourably. And in the Wandering Rocks episode, the cavalcade continues on the journey we saw mapped through the city and to its destination in Ballsbridge. In the Sirens episode then, when we move to the next episode, the clock is rewound slightly to pause at one of the many places through which the cavalcade has passed and to witness or overhear, more accurately, what occurs after that sound has erupted into the environment and the viceregal party has moved on. Restarted, the tape now plays from a reverse angle, which is to say from the differing perspective of the bar. Bronze by Gold, Miss Douce's head by Miss Kennedy's head over the crossblind of the Ormond bar, heard the viceregal hoofs go by, ringing steel. So on the other side of these fragments that we stumble over, we get this replaying, this reversal of the same moment. And then Miss Douce, in her role as a sort of Medusa, if we think of her as Miss Douce's head, flattens her face against the pane in a halo of hurried breath. So here we have Miss Douce's head transformed in the moment into her altered self, spreading trails of breath, creating the effect of the halo of snakes perhaps surrounding her mouth, a gaping hole, her sigh capable of petrifying a man. He's killed looking back, she says of one of the occupants. Sirens is an experiment in the rendering of acoustic and musical content in prose. So this is Joyce's experiment. How can I evoke music within literature? Is it possible for me to do so? And he tries in lots of different ways in the episode. And I think by doing so, he amplifies then the soundscape of the entire book. It's the Siren's sonic abundance encourages the reader to listen back then to the sound effects in earlier episodes and to pay more attention to those yet to come. A multitude of sound effects are thus highlighted, and our attention is drawn back to moments like that strange whistle that we hear answering Buck Mulligan in the opening page, or to the third-apart overtone that comes from the bells of St. George's in Bloom's morning when he sits in the outhouse and comes following through the air. Or perhaps in the Hades episode, where we hear from afar, away from everything else that is happening, a donkey bray. Or thinking forward to in Sandymount, where we have far in the grey, again, there's a sound coming from somewhere afar, a bell chiming, or even onto the whistle of the train that Molly incorporates into her monologue in Penelope. So day and night, Dublin is a noisy city. Angela Fraterola has written that modernists wanted their novels to sound out, to be listened to, and they achieved this by including the sounds of every day in their works and paying particular attention to how their characters are shaped by these sounds. In context, the formal experiments for which modernists are so well known, stream of consciousness, fragments and non-linear narratives, poetic prose, so all things we think about in terms of Joyce, all hinge on a shift in sensibilities from the eye to the ear. And I think also that they hinge on the desire to capture something of the simultaneity of multiple sounds happening at once. We can also see such simultaneity evoked in the episode's description of the city, and Dublin is very small in this episode. It's full of coincidences and chance happenings and overlapping journeys. It is close enough that we seem to hear Boylan's movement up O'Connell Street, Sackville Street, the knock on the door of 7 Eccles Street, the jingle of the bed. It seems to be simultaneous, almost the way Leah represented it for us there, that these sounds are all happening at once. The sonic effects of events which occur offstage enter the soundscape of the city. The opening section of the episode thus sets out a paradigm. Both the text and the world it attempts to portray are made up of multiple sounds coexisting. In the simplest sense of a musical fugue, a phrase is presented by one part and then successively taken up by others, eventually interweaving. Whether Joyce achieves an exact replica is debatable. However, in a broader sense, there are multiple lines here which coalesce. Joyce is extending here the stylistic manoeuvres of Wandering Rocks, the previous episode, where we have the insertion of little snippets from simultaneously occurring events which come into each section. And here I think he tries to create in Sirens a more unified, richer, harmonious air. And there's certainly something fugal about the presentation of Bloom's initial journey through the city with what is simultaneously occurring in the Sirens bar, and also in the subsequent weaving of those lines together. So we do not think of literature as the primary realm in which multiple voices can sing together, but it is nonetheless what modernist literature is often trying to represent. So if we think of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, it attempts to capture the sense of myriad sounds simultaneously echoing through a city. And I think of her writing this in the wake of World War I and the 1918 pandemic, and how that novel really glorifies, as does Ulysses, the ability of crowds to interact in a city, to experience the same sounds from different places and with different individual resonances. These thoughts on how to capture a city soundscape in art bring me to a very recent work by an Irish composer, Rachel Nicune. She works with sound and movement, text and electronics, and her latest sound piece was commissioned by the Irish Cultural Centre in Paris to mark this same centenary of the publication of Ulysses that we are marking. It's described as a sort of Ulysses audio tour titled Ballade Audio Joyce in Paris, and you can listen to it on their website. Nicune suggests listening to this sound piece in the dark with your eyes closed, perhaps wearing headphones, or perhaps walking down the banks of the Seine. It's a multi-layered piece. She's not trying to capture the sounds of 1922 or necessarily the sounds of the Sirens episode, but rather the city soundscape which a contemporary visitor to Paris might experience. Walking around Paris, she has captured the sounds of the city, the bells, the horns of cars, crowds bustling, people speaking in French, an ambulance sirens perhaps, winds, a tapping cane. At times these notes are distinct, and at other times they're blurred together to create another sound. So Nicune is considering in this work Joyce's own navigations around the city. She thinks about how his good ears showed him the way. I don't know if I have that quote in. So she's echoing Joyce's own perambulations, but what strikes me about the work is how she also echoes something of what Joyce was trying to do in Ulysses in capturing a city soundscape. At one point during the piece, she narrates to us her own progress as she stands outside 12 Rue de l'Odéon, 12 that we've heard much of, and she imagines, though, she's standing there and she actually sees a man reading a copy of Ulysses, and she sort of says to herself, I'll go back. If he's still there, I'll talk to him. And then she chickens out and doesn't. So we get this little just moment of what's happening as she takes her trip this year around Paris. But she also imagines finding something left behind by the composer George Antheil, who lived for a time above Shakespeare and Company, and whose cacophonous works were filled with the sounds of modern city life, complete with sirens and aeroplane propellers. Joyce and Antheil considered an opera together, of which, unfortunately, only a fragment remains. But in this coming together of these different timelines and sounds and memories, I think there's something of that sort of a map unfettered by temporal concerns that we saw in David Lilburn's work. I noticed in one moment that Katherine Flynn brought up for us, we had the 18th century Customs House, and beside it we had Liberty Hall, which was not built till 1965, and the two came together. And Nicune is doing something similar in this sound map, where Joyce's time and her own, in thoughts, her own memories, she thinks of what Joyce's memories might have been as he walks the street, are overlapped. And this sonic exploration to me suggests something about Joyce's texts and show us how much his text seems to uncannily predict what will come in terms of digital music and the possibilities of a radio soundscape, for example. The opening of the Sirens episode, so experimental in terms of prose, would not seem so radical to us if we were to hear it in a piece of digital music. The idea of individual fragments of lyrics and sound effects all sounded at once, an overview perhaps of what is to come in the episode. Simultaneity, though, is so much easier for the contemporary composer to achieve. Earlier, another composer, Luciano Berio, also took the opening of the Sirens episode to create one of the first pieces of digital music. And when you listen to it, it's like the opening of Sirens, but even more fragmented, and as though you're hearing it through perhaps water or an old radio, and you can't quite tune in. Nicune asks us to orientate ourselves through sound, much as the text does. A centenary on from this soundscape imagines Joyce moving through Paris. So she reads this little passage over the soundscape. Now, Jim would have had his cane, an ash plant, proud Irish wood, tapping and poking at the Paris streets, not just to test and see what they're made of, but also to navigate by touch and sound. And this navigation is obviously, there are echoes here of the blind piano tuner that we heard of, and also of Stephen Dedalus on Sandymount Strand as he moves along, closing his eyes and navigating himself, hitting on a rock. Sounds solid, he thinks to himself. So the solidity of the rock has been confirmed by hitting it, but sounds here are also become an essence, an entity, something of the metallic voices that Leah referred to. They are solid, they move through the city, affecting things, moving characters, directing attention and observations. Nicune's piece is not focused on being the navigator of the city, but closer, I think, to the movement of the reader through Joyce's texts. How does one navigate this cityscape? Are the sounds I'm hearing sirens or lighthouses? So focusing on mapping in this way that we are in this conference, gathering around the literary mapping exhibition at the Huntington, I think can change the way we read some of these texts. I was returning to Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower in preparation for coming here, knowing that she would be part of the exhibition. And I found that my sense of the California that she's describing moved from something quite abstract and into the particular as I imagined myself coming to that space. And that changed the way that I thought about the map then, which I saw in the exhibition. The gated community in which Lauren Olumina's family first live, I was encountering imaginatively, but now I'm thinking about it, of course, in terms of her visual representation and being in the place itself. And that also made me pay more attention, I think, to an aspect of the main character, Lauren. She has a hyper-empathy, a condition in which she experiences the physical sufferings of others as though they happen to her. And so her navigation of space is ruled by this sensitivity. Leopold Bloom's empathy may not be on quite the same level as Lauren's. However, he too navigates his Dublin with not only his own sensitivities to protect, but I think with a heightened alertness to the pain or discomfort of others. And this necessitates a protective layer when it comes to navigating soundscape. Sounds infiltrate in the Sirens episode. The opening sounds of the hoofs represent the reach of colonial sound, of colonial power, and in turn they are responded to by the nationalistic ballad, The Crappy Boy, which changes then the soundscape in the room. Bloom, I think, has to be careful at times about what he hears. Again, back to that term that Katherine Flynn brought up in her keynote, that he has to practice a sort of hear-someness rather than encountering all the sounds that are around him. He must develop strategies like Odysseus to get him beyond the full realm of sound. Better to get out before the end, he thinks to himself. And I think this is a challenge to Bloom because he is, in fact, a very sensitive and careful listener. We might notice how he hears tiny modulations in the voice of his cat in the Calypso episode when we first meet him. He knows that the piano has been tuned since he was last in the Ormond Hotel. He can analyse in detail the manner in which a line of music is sung. And he can even intuit in the Circe episode that it is Stephen Dedalus, a young man who he does not know particularly well, who is playing a series of empty fifths on the pianola in the brothel while Bloom stands outside. And this, I think, is a really significant moment in the soundscape of this Odyssey. The coming together of the two men occurs when Bloom hears Stephen and goes to him. Stephen is a sort of siren here, issuing his call, his danger signal, his warning, and most importantly, his voice, in a more abstract sense of the word, calling Bloom, the attentive listener, to him. And we might notice also how these two men alone, of all the characters, hear sounds differently. Here they are when they have finally come together in Ithaca, and they hear the sounds again of those bells from St. George's Church that Bloom heard earlier in the day. What sound accompanied the union of their tangent, the disunion of their respectively centrifugal and centripetal hands? The sound of the peal of the hour of the night by the chime of the bells in the church of St. George. What echoes of that sound were by both and each heard. And so we have then from Stephen, what Stephen is hearing, or what's resonating for him as he hears the bells, is a Latin prayer said over dying people. Bloom, however, is hearing a more relaxed, informal, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, I presume, and bringing us back to the church in the morning, but also taking us away from the cuckoo that we hear earlier in the day, which has more personal resonances perhaps for Bloom in his current state. The novelist Ocean Vuong has considered the root of the word monster or monstrum, and considered it to be at once a hybrid signal, a lighthouse, both shelter and warning at once. And I think there's something of this in the way Joyce thinks about his sirens in this episode. Richard Ellman wrote that for the Sirens episode, Joyce quizzed Philip Jourretche one day about sirens, from those who inhabited the Mediterranean rocks to those who are found in factories. So the sirens of Ulysses range from those that falsely promise that all will be well, as the barmaids say, raise the conch to your ear and listen in, to those that emanate danger signals. There are many sirens lurking in the shadows of the episode. Molly Bloom may lie remotely in her bed at the end of Ulysses, but her metaphysical presence, if you like, is palpable in the bar. She draws the attention of the men who gossip about her. She lures both Boylan physically and Bloom emotionally towards her. And Bloom is a siren too, but closer perhaps to those found in factories, issuing distress signals, like the struck tuning fork of the episode, perhaps only perceptible entirely to the readers. It's something which sends out a message to the distance or to the future, or perhaps to both. And this sense of movement as a tension between two places or people is at times exemplified in Joyce's trope of a call and response, the setting up of an antiphony, a back and forth between two voices. In Sirens, we had Leah brought us to this moment earlier of the tuning fork which is struck, and it's such a central moment in the episode, and it is responded to by the crescendo of the tap of the piano tuner's stick as he approaches the Ormond bar. It is not sound alone which operates like this in Joyce's texts. Smells, colours, that which can affect the senses, move through time and space. In Nausicaa, Bloom ponders on the movement of perfume. Mysterious thing too. Why did I smell it only now? Took its time in coming, like herself, slow but sure. Sure, it's ever so million of tiny grains blown across. I've spoken how Joyce faced the limits that Luciano Berio or Rachel Nicune did not in their recorded sounds, easily capable of capturing simultaneous sounds. But literary soundscapes and musical novels have other potentialities. Without the restrictions of the musical composer, the writer can imagine any sound, and their work can take on the aspect of the what if. What if a tuning fork was to be struck? What next? What if the sounds were to cross the city? What if the tuning fork was to call back a piano tuner, call him to the Ormond bar if it was struck by one man whose son later that day will make a call, issuing a musical call to bring a person towards him who might be his prospective father? What if, as all of Finnegan's Wake asks, you could understand the languages of the world and hear them run together like a giant fugue? What if the piece could run forever? What if the music was not fettered by decision, instrument, human capabilities? Or what if, as in the opening of Sirens to conclude, you gathered together the sonic fragments of an afternoon musical session in Dublin, not just the notes, but the inner thoughts of characters, the sounds entering from the outside, the sounds departing the arena, the echoes and reiterations, the silences before and after an event, the inner sounds emanating from a conch held to one's ear, of that one imagines watching someone else place a conch to their ear. What navigations might that produce? Thank you.
Great, so we've got time, and I know that Leah and Katherine would be grateful for your questions.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for those concentrating our attention cognitively on the oral landscape of the Sirens episode and the potentiality of what sound amounts to in Ulysses. I would characterize the subject of both of your talks to be the Sirens ensemble of pinpointed sounds. And I wonder what you might think of my observation that this is something that Joyce pioneered before cinema developed sound, but which is now known in cinematic terms as sound design. That is, sound designers in cinema today and for quite a long time are people who select a range of acoustic elements that are potentially audible components of a scene that's being set in a movie, that they zoom in on or zoom out. In other words, they're selecting sounds to articulate them, to chart or to awaken an emotional anticipation on the part of the audience members. So often when we're seeing a movie and we're hearing the sounds, we're not hearing the sounds that you would hear if you're there. We're hearing the sounds that the sound designers are selecting in order to make, to chart a kind of an emotional itinerary. And often I find it interesting in movies that you hear a sound that is coming from the future. And as you were talking about the Sirens episode, I couldn't help but think, oh, everything that we know about sound design is already there in Ulysses.
We're so accustomed to it when we're watching a movie. Am I saying?
There you go.
Oh, there. I'm sorry. I'm off it now. Okay. We're so accustomed when we're watching a movie to understanding, you know, what I'm hearing now, the character is not hearing, or now I'm in the sound world of the character and this is what they're hearing, and we move. I think as audience, we're quite sophisticated at this point with that. And yet I think Joyce is trying to achieve something of that. You know, we're moving in and out of what's actually occurring in the episode, what's in his mind, and maybe some sort of emotional soundtrack that's happening at the same time. And it does ask a lot of us as readers, because, you know, we have these different ways in the episode in which Joyce lets us know that a piece of music is being performed. And he tries it out in different ways. Sometimes he has the actual lyrics, and so that sort of intersects the text, and you think to yourself, okay, the piece is still playing, I should be imagining that performance is still happening in the background. And in other places, he interweaves it with Bloom's thoughts, and Bloom is sort of thinking about it. So it's a little bit further away from us. And it's a sort of heroic reader, maybe, that would be able to keep the music in their mind all of the time.
Yeah, I also agree that this episode is really designed, right? And so I like your analogy to sound design. Picking up on a phrase you use, zooming in and zooming out, I think that especially works well with kind of Katherine's look at this replaying element of the sounds and almost magnifying certain sounds by their repetition in different ways. And also, I think that this is definitely not, if we're going to liken it to a stage, it's definitely not a theater stage, right? This would definitely have to be a movie set, because it is kind of 360, and I think also the use of lyrics being italic. Oftentimes, when they're kind of punctuating the chapter, shows these different layers, right? Like italic text is thinner, it looks more fragile, and it's almost, to me, kind of feels like background, right? Whereas the tap, tap, tap is coming in more at the foreground, more of that zoomed in portion.
So right here, yeah.
The program that you built, and it looked like you had a list of other ones. Are those accessible for us to explore?
Oh, those other ones are not mine. Those are kind of other projects that other Joyceans have worked on. This is, I suppose I could share the link somewhere. It's just using a website called roundme.com. Businesses use it to put virtual tours on Google Maps. So.
So I really like how this panel complicates the opposition we set up maybe yesterday between maps and experience or associations. And, you know, the sonic, the representations of sound that both of you trace are actually ways of, or descriptions of the spatial mapping that occurs through sensation. And so they combine both mapping and experience. But maybe in kind of, you know, response to this last question, Joyce can't resist going further. And so layering over that seemingly realistic, you could say kind of alternative cartography, it's kind of sensory cartography, wider associations or wider perceptions beyond that kind of realist ambit of perception. And I mean, this is in a way, this is more of a comment really than a question. But I just want to ask, you know, maybe Leah, but also Katherine, what consequences that has for the episode as something that's exploring the possibilities of these modalities of perception, often in people with kind of, who are limited in some respects, but then have expanded capacities in other respects, or, you know, what it is, why Joyce is creating something that is so, has such a complex relationship to, let's say, realism. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I was practicing this morning, I actually thought, oh no, did I just create a bad map? Did I just undo my first statement, which was that this isn't an aerial view? But I think in some ways I did wind up saying that we are, in the same way that you sort of try and swallow a place whole when you're looking at an aerial map, the Sirens episode, especially with kind of the fragmented summary at the beginning, is sort of asking you to swallow it whole and take it all in at once. But then the experience of reading it, and especially if we kind of bring in that melodic aspect to it, it's rhythmic, so it's time dependent, and you kind of can't get every sense at once because you can only read one song lyric at a time, you can only read one tap at a time. But yeah, I think then it kind of loops back to still becoming as all these senses are coming in and link to locationality. I don't know, maybe is it an inverse aerial map? I'm not sure.
Colleen, do you have it? No. Okay. Eric, are you up?
Yeah, and this is, I'm just a quick kind of, I guess, building on the previous questions, but I was listening to both talks, I started to wonder if when we're reading Sirens, is it a live event or is it a recording? And and partly that's because, so you know, on the one hand, it's like I want to pretend as if it's really happening, but even, of course, this is so carefully curated, and Joyce and the narrator is playing with our attention, and it's being mediated through Bloom's body and memory, et cetera. But I was also thinking that once you begin to think of it as it's already a recording, then I was thinking, well, you know, at the time, of course, Joyce, who we know is interested in cinema, he's interested in recording technologies. He's, you know, if anything, he's trying to be as cool as the futurists, who he knows, and he's following carefully in Trieste, because they're coming to Trieste, and they're the ones getting all the attention, because they've done amazing things with the performance, the serata, and everything else they're doing on stage, and all of a sudden they're redefining what it means to have a live event and a recording, and they're beginning to experiment with radio, right? So I wonder if, you know, how that might actually, if we think of, you know, Ulysses is not just a book, it's a media machine, right? And it's a recording versus a live event, how that might then inform the way you talk about sound.
Is that back on? Yeah. Great question, Eric. Thank you so much. My sense of the interplay between the opening of Sirens and the main body of the episode is that it isn't on the same plane. It isn't an overture and then the rest of the piece of music. Instead, we have a movement between a score and a performance of that score. And that would suggest multiple more performances are possible of that initial score as well. And that's not to suggest that Joyce wrote the score first and then did a performance of it. In fact, unfortunately for my theory, he seems to have put the intro in afterwards, but I think that's the effect that's created, that if you take this essence, you can then play it out one way. So it's sort of echoing the fact that the book itself starts at 8 a.m. and then begins at 8 a.m. again, and that it is a sort of performance of that day. In terms then of whether it's an actual recording, I mean, I think you sort of refer to one of the challenges, which is who is directing our attention in this episode. You know, we have these inner thoughts of Bloom, which are in some ways, as readers, on the same plane as the sounds that are actually, you know, being rendered in the episode. So would the recording be able to hear his thoughts, if you like? And also, I suppose this is in terms of the mapping of the episode. We seem to move with Blazes Boylan through the city streets, and he arrives and knocks on the door of Eccles Street. But perhaps that is all a fearful projection in Bloom's mind of what is happening at that time. But the text doesn't distinguish between the two. So maybe the imagined map that Bloom has in his mind has been overlaid in some way with what we might think is the more realistic map of the episode. Leah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I kind of want to say almost, well, yes, it has to be a recording because it's written, right? We're not in this Dublin anymore, right? But then also at the same time, I really liked your description of the fragments as the score that comes before, so it's kind of like the warming up. So then I wonder, is just that the recording? Or I guess that wouldn't make sense, but I suppose I don't have a good answer, except that I need to think about that more because I think that blows up a lot. And I think even what I created is sort of, could be created as a recording to a recording, right? Because there has to be this extra level of mediation if we're not if we're not experiencing it live. But thank you. Not an answer, but a thanks.
We're at the end of our time, and what follows is lunch, so I daren't let us run over. I have one kind of housekeeping announcement, and that is that today's panelists and the conveners of the conference are asked to gather outside for like a group selfie or something. But the rest of you should get immediately to lunch, and we will be there shortly after you. And Steve has, no. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin, for chairing. Yes, those of you who have spoken and the conveners, please, could you just gather on the northern side of Rothenberg Hall so we can take a photograph of you with the mountains behind you? That would seem to be appropriate. Thanks.